Do not forget, you can support the channel with a like, and you can also subscribe to be aware of the latest published videos. Thank you. We hope that here you can find the latest news, ideas, and discoveries from the scientific world.
In 1969, 13 hippies made their way to the Hawaiian jungle to create their own utopia. What was life like with no rules? As the 1960s drew to a close, a sense of disillusionment was spreading throughout the United States. With the traumas of the Vietnam War and the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King ringing in their ears, during the spring of 1969 a group of 13 youngsters fled to the island of Kauai in Hawaii. Their goal was to create their own utopia. This utopia would be one where the general consensus revolved around a society with no sole leader. There would be no laws and no religious doctrines. Utopia took time to establish and was met with resistance, with the first inhabitants of the camp jailed under state vagrancy laws. Their savior came in the form of Howard Taylor, brother of Elizabeth Taylor, who after hearing of the imprisoned young hippies not only bailed them out, but also offered them 7 acres of his own beachfront land on the island, on which they could build a new camp. In gratitude, they called it Taylor Camp. With the camp established, the numbers steadily grew as college kids, war veterans, draft dodgers, fugitives of the law, surfers, and other general seekers of peace and love made their way to the island to seek out the community. In Taylor Camp, clothing was optional, marijuana was abundant, and its inhabitants strove to become self-sufficient. The small area of island paradise was worked and enjoyed. In short, it was the epitome of the hippie dream. Children rode the bus to attend the local school and food was harvested. The shortfall was made up with food stamps. While islanders resented the mass influx of hippies and their liberal way of life, they valued the fact that the campers were willing to work in exchange for cash as they built their dream. As families arrived, tree houses and handcrafted structures were built to house the camp's residents. For inhabitants, the camp seemed the perfect place to raise children, immersed in nature and free from the restrictions of society. Camp residents imagined how different life could be if their children lived in a society that revolved around peace, nature, and harmony. By its peak, Taylor Camp had a population of 120. As the population grew, unwritten laws were made. The camp soon had its own mayor, sheriff, ex-military medic, and midwife, appointed within the ranks of the residents. Taylor Camp began to take on the shape of a society, but maintained an emphasis on absolute freedom. From 1971, the dynamic new culture thriving in Taylor Camp was documented by photographer John Hawaiian, who was able to build the trust of the residents, wary of his presence to begin with. Over time, he was able to observe firsthand just how the camp functioned. Taylor Camp wasn't a commune. It had no guru, no clearly defined leadership, and never had a single voice. It had no written ordinances. It wasn't a democracy. It was much more than that, a community guided by a spirit that created order without rules. Taylor Camp was not perfect. Just as in any community, addiction, violence, disease, alcoholism, and sexual abuse occurred. But eventually the campers' way of living, deemed adverse by many locals and the local authorities, became too much, and in 1973 the Utopia began its demise when the settlement was condemned. From this point on, as the legal battles began to seem futile, many residents started to leave the camp. By 1977, just a handful remained when the camp was raided and evictions were made. Taylor Camp was then burned to the ground. Sam Lee, retired State Department of Land and Natural Resources land agent, was the man responsible for surveying, evicting, and then burning the camp to the ground. He later reflected on the task. Those of us who wore pants and shoes and socks and collared shirts to work every day probably felt envious of those folks who just lived such a life, such a great life. For me, evicting the campers was not a happy experience. There was no joy in doing what we had to do. Exactly how Taylor Camp would have progressed had it not been destroyed remains a subject of fascination for many. 3 decades later, Hawaiian revisited the camp with a documentary. During filming, he interviewed the hippies who had called the haven home. 30 years later, when we tracked down and interviewed many of the campers, most, but not all, were nostalgic, recalling their time at the camp as the best days of our lives. But I think that may be true for many Americans of the boomer generation. We remember the 60 seconds and 70 seconds as a period of excitement, radical change, hope, and possibility. We were young and we were free because we possessed little but youth and no student loan debt.